And project management, basically you focus on trying to produce quality products and meet commitment. And the key here is to know where you are. Fred Brooks makes a wonderful point, said schedule slip a day at a time. And the issue is, if you don't know that you're a day behind schedule, you can't catch up. And with today's software projects, by and large, people have no idea where they are until they get into test. You ask the programmers where they are, and they say, I'm nearly done. You're 90% through coding most of the project. So they really don't know. Which means nobody knows. Which means you can't recover. You finally discover you're in trouble at the last minute and you can't possibly catch up. That's the issue we deal with. So you've got to understand status all the time. You've got to follow a process. You got to understand your plan and rebalance it. When somebody's late, you got to look for somebody to ahead and fix it and adjust it. You got to, the protection is the key issue. I mean, people are constantly getting pulled off projects to move on to something else that's in more trouble. Well, that means you're moving trouble around, right? It means you get everybody in trouble. Until all of a sudden everybody's screaming and then you stop moving people. Well, that's nuts. And so that's the issue. You've got to keep every project up to speed, but you've got to protect the resources. You can't just keep balancing them forward. And this means fundamentally the developers have to track their own work. They have to do it right. I mean, if you think about quality in this sense, the real definition of high quality work is doing it once. You do it right the first time, it's a lot more economical than fixing the poor work time and time again, because you're constantly reworking it. And so people have to do that, and they have to know how to do quality work, and they have to be able to work and follow the practices they know they ought to follow. And finally, of course, you need to have people that are properly trained. They know how to do all of this stuff. And that requires that they're properly led, coached, and rewarded. Now, coaching is an interesting one. We actually talk about coaching. I'll be talking about something called the TSP. How many of you have heard of the TSP? Okay, okay. That's the team software process. And the idea of that, and we actually introduced something we call coaches. And when you have a ball team that is in the cellar year after year, what do? You fire the coach, right? You don't fire the players, you fire the coach. You get a better coach. Now there you are focused on people. This is a people issue. What's interesting is in software, and in hardware development too for that matter, we don't have coaching. And so, fundamentally, it's not a matter of good and bad coaching. We got none. What we find with the TSP, we actually do train people to be coaches. We have coaches. They're not on the team. They're not team leaders. They're coaches. And the quality of the coaching actually governs the quality of the work. It's amazing. So better coached teams perform better. Now that's true in every other field. Why not in software? Well, it turns out to be equally true as well. And of course, fundamentally, you got to be recognized and rewarded. How many of you work in organizations where there's a lot of firefighting? Any of you? Right? Okay. Well, what you notice when you look around, who gets promoted? The really good firefighters, right? So an organization, what do you got to have to get promoted? You got to fire, right? That's what it takes to get ahead. And so obviously we've got fires. Lots of fires, and we recognize and reward firefighting. So the issue is to recognize and reward quality work. The problem is quality work is almost invisible. All you did was deliver a product on schedule that had no defect. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Well, that's non-trivial. That's a tough piece of work. So rewarding that is critically important. And the problem is most managers wouldn't recognize it if it was there. Key issue. So the problem with management styles we've had three kinds of management. This is switching gears now, talking about the technology and the whole issue about knowledge work. And now when you come back to that, how do you manage this? And when you look at the way we've managed historically, there's sort of body management, which is you treat people as muscles. And the second kind of management is task management. Frederick Winslow Taylor came up with that. This is over 100 years ago about. This is sort of the basic logic behind the factory. And you treat people as machines. They're in there producing stuff, and they're kind of flexible machines, and that's what they do. And finally, for knowledge management, you're treating people as creative individuals. Quite a different step. And fundamentally, almost all the management, you've heard about software factories and everything, sort of the paradigm people are after is how do we get to where we manage software like a factory? That's sort of what you sort of think, hey, that's the way to manage stuff. It's predictable and stuff comes out in an orderly way and all that. Well, it fundamentally won't work for knowledge work. I mean, that's task management. This is where we got to go. And if you look at this, body management's how they built the pyramids. It's slavery work. The management style is through fear. That's what you're doing fundamentally. And task management, knowledge work, you got to have incentives. You know how piecework is in factories? You establish a standard rate. Here's what everybody's paid against, and you get, so much, and you get bonuses for producing more than the standard rate. Well, what you discover in a factory where you're paid like that, nobody produces more than the standard rate. Because they learn real quick, if you do, the standard rate's going to go up. So no one produces more than the standard rate. So you've got competition. You've got management basically says, we know how to do the job, and here's what we're striving to do. And you really do. You've got, fundamentally, the workers and managers, the workers are trying to get maximum pay for minimum work. And the managers are trying to get maximum work for minimum pay. And it's not a good way to get a cooperative environment. They're not working together. The managers understand the job. They're trying to drive people to do it that way. And they don't trust their workers to try to do it right. So they got to monitor it and control it. And that's what we talk about as the way you manage factories. So you talk about a software factory, we're talking about managing like that. That ain't right. And typical management styles, what's taught in business schools, the way it's all based on that style. And it's wrong. It doesn't work for our stuff. So knowledge work, the key principles here are, first of all, only the workers understand the work. The managers can't tell people how to do it because they don't know. So the workers have to be able, they have to understand it. They've got to manage themselves since nobody else can. And you got to trust them. It's got to be a trusting environment, which means that you got to motivate them, you got to lead them, guide them, and coach them. Quite a different environment. And so the knowledge workers, to manage themselves, you're not beginning to see managers. And we don't see knowledge workers coming out of school with any training at all in management, which is unfortunate, which is why that's what we do in the TSP. We start by training them. How do you make personal plans? How do you make accurate plans that you can count on? How do you negotiate a commitment? How do you track your work? How do you do consistently high-quality work so you don't have to rebuild it all the time? That's the only way you can do stuff that you can consistently plan. That's fundamental. That's the way you've got to work to manage knowledge work. And if you don't get there, you're still working like the old factory worker. And the reason you are, it's not because managers are bad, by the way. Because if the knowledge workers can't do any of this stuff, who's got to manage it? manager. Because the knowledge workers aren't managing themselves. And when they don't manage themselves, the managers have got to try. Because the managers get in trouble if they don't. Now, it turns out they can't do it either, which is why software gets in trouble so much. So the issue we're after here is, to really solve the problem, you got to get at the fundamental cause of the problem, which is the knowledge workers can't manage knowledge work. And the point is, software is the first of our knowledge industries, and it won't be the last. As I say, that's where everything is going. The world is getting soft. So that's what the TSP is designed for. It is a knowledge working process. And what we do, as I say, we start by training the developers, what we call the PSP, the personal software process. We train them on how to manage their personal work and how to define their own or make their own plan. And then in the TSP, we actually go through and guide them through defining their own process, making their own plans, negotiating their commitment, and then tracking and managing their work, their personal work, their team's work, and their project. And it's interesting, it's amazing, it does work. And at the beginning of a project, we have a team launch, where we actually launched them. How many of you went to, Jim McHale had a tutorial on this the other day. Many of you see that? Okay, so you saw more about this. Well, I'll repeat it a little bit for the rest. But Jim went through this, what was it, a half-day tutorial, Jim? Something like that? Yeah. Oh, was it Monday? Monday, yeah. But so it walks through what it is. And is it in the CD at all, the tutorial? Oh, it is in the CD, so you can flip through that and look at it, so you get a sense for what it was. But in the launch meeting, meeting one, it starts it off, and we have management come. These are the people who actually decided to do this work. And we have senior management meet with the team and explain it. Here's what we want and why. What's interesting is many teams have never had that opening discussion. No one has ever explained what the purpose of the project was. So the managers start explaining the project. Here's what we want. Then the team produces a plan. Here's an example. This was the project, it was a team in Chicago, and they were building a communication testing device for telephone line in Europe. And it was a new device, new hardware, new software, quite tricky and complicated. The key was that the product had to be available in 9 months. It was a real challenge for the team. And so we went from this to meeting 2. And meeting 2, now the meeting 1 is with management. And then the team goes off, and here's what we want. And then the team goes off and makes a plan, comes back and says, here's what we can do. This is negotiating a commitment. Teams don't normally do that. Normally I see software groups, managers have got to have it in 9 months. And the team kind of grumbles that that's hard, and they end up saying, well, okay, we'll try. But when management says we got to have it in 9 months, management owns the 9 months. Then the team complains, the management beats them up and says you got to do it in 9 months. And the team finally says, okay, it's hard, but we'll try. Then the team owns the 9 months. They just fought it. So even though they don't want it, they're committed to 9 months. So we tell our teams, don't do that. Don't try to negotiate the commitment until you've got a plan and know what you can do. So they go off and produce a plan. This team was very upset. They really had all kinds of concerns. Because the last project had taken a couple of years, it was a disaster. And this is a tougher job. So we told them to make a plan. So we actually spent several days, 3 days. It's a 4-day launch. They spent 3 more days, and the 4th day we go back to the team. And they went through the launch. I was the coach on this team, so I knew what they were doing. And they went through it. They produced the plan and the risks, and made a presentation, and they came back in the final meeting to management. And that's when they go through and say, here's what we can do. Well, what they did here, this is what they came back with. And their schedule, instead of 9 months, was 18 months. 77 weeks is 18 months. Management didn't like that at all. All kinds of arguments and debates, and I won't go into all of them. I'm running out of time here. But the point is, they finally bought it. And when the team delivered, they actually came in a few weeks early, and they had a very good estimate. And they had a very high-quality product. Typical, by the way, integration and system test defects will be around 20 defects per 1,000 lines of code. And they were 0.6. Enormous improvement. And their testing time is much less. And this was, they had, when I got this data, this is after about 1.5 years, product had been out that had several thousand units shipped to the customers, and they had no problems reported by the extruder. And this is typical. We're seeing this very often with our TSP team. And the point is, we are developing fundamental skills. We're showing the developers how to manage themselves. We're actually enabling management to trust the team. Management would like to trust the team. But the teams have got to be trustworthy. The teams have got to be able to make responsible commitments. And the TSP shows them how to do that. We got lots of people who have used it now. A few hundred companies, many, many teams. And we got a lot of experience. Here's one with Intuit. Before the TSP, they would have 2 months of development and 4 months of test. That was their standard development cycle. With the TSP now, they have 4 months of development and 1 month of test. I mean, that's really something. This is an 8 times improvement. That's basically what they found. They were spending 33% of all their resources were spent on testing beforehand. And now they're down to a few percent. I mean, it really is an enormous difference. And this is very consistent. So there are lots of cases, and what was interesting is the bottom line. The engineers like it. They feel they own it. They're in control. It's not somebody telling them what to do. They're negotiating their commitment. And it works. So that's the key. Software has been a problem for management because it's knowledge work. Knowledge work takes a new management paradigm. You can't just manage it like a factory. It doesn't work. And that's where we're going. So if we got a couple of minutes for a question or two? Any questions? Yes?
How you can manage discipline in a team?
How do you manage discipline?
Discipline. Right.
Okay. Well, the way, the point here is you motivate discipline. It's very hard to manage it. So to get the team, and of course you got to come back to what do you mean by discipline. And in the TSP, the disciplines we require of TSP teams are when they do have to actually track their time and the defects that they find. So they actually track their work, and by tracking their time, they know they can manage schedule. And by measuring and tracking their defects, they can manage quality. And so that's what the key is to do that. And so that when the developers are trained on this and learn how to do it, that's key. Second is they've got a team that's all doing it. Third, they've got a coach that's helping them and guiding them. And a team leader that has basically got goals and standards that says, hey, we're going to do it this way. And so when you have an environment that is disciplined, personal discipline isn't this hard. Okay? Thank you. Anybody else?
Questions?
No?
No more questions?
There's one right here. You got it?
In an ever-changing world, how can you manage flexibility? Because you keep the goals to the team, they work in a project, they decide how to manage themselves. But sometimes in a 77-week project, the goals of the higher level administration can change, or the environment can change. So you you have to start a new project, or how can you manage this?
Oh, okay. Well, the issue here is change. And the key issue, and I didn't have time to go into it here, but to manage change, and this is true on every project, to manage change, one, you've got to know where you are, right? I mean, you can't figure out what the impact of a change is unless you know where you are. So you've got to know where you are. You've got to know what the change affects on what you've done and what you've got to do. You've got to then look at how this affects your plan. And then you've got to negotiate the change with the person who wants you to make the change. And so that's how you've got to manage it. And one of the key issues we have with software is the development team don't know when they face a change, they don't know what it's going to cost them. So they can't negotiate it. And by and large, the changes come in multiple varieties. The changes where people say, yeah, that's what I meant. It's not really a change, it's part of what was there all along. The second change is, yes, we're together on what we want. Here we got to do it, this added thing. And we can negotiate it. And the third is a really big change, a major change. So the lots of little changes are the real exposure on most projects. The big changes, you know, you go back and look at it, you know that. But the small changes are the issue. And those are the ones that individuals have to be able to go back and assess and logically decide, can we do it? And if we can, is it going to take more time, or can we do it within the resources we've got? And that means they've got to know the impact of it. Okay? And if you don't have details on your plans and stages, you can't figure that out. Right. Okay. But you're right. That's key. That's true on every project. They all change. Well, let me answer the question differently. When I talk to people, I say, why are your projects, did they get in trouble? And the reason almost always is the requirements change. Right? So when people complain about requirements changing, what they're basically saying is, somebody else did it to me. Right? They say it was their fault. Right? Well, the other way of looking at that is, the general view then is that the right project is one where the requirements don't change. But second is, that never happens. So that means that instead of having a process that will never work unless the requirements don't change, we need a process that will always work when the requirements do change. And that's what we're talking about. Okay? Okay, I think we are out of time.
There is a question.
Thank you so much.
One more, please.
Oh, one more?
One more, please.
Got one more?
One more, please.
Oh, good, yes.
Normalmente los proyectos tienen que ser aprobados previamente por la gerencia y tiene que haber un presupuesto. ¿Cómo se maneja este tipo de cosas en un proyecto TSP? Puesto que los miembros del grupo son los que definen el trabajo que se va a hacer, el cronograma que se va a desarrollar. ¿Cómo se maneja la aprobación del presupuesto y la estimación inicial dentro de un proyecto TSP?
The question is, and in a lot of projects, especially in government, you have to get approval based on a plan when you do an acquisition. How does that work with TSP when the plan doesn't happen until the development of what we do yes or no?
Oh, you're saying you do just like you get a contract ahead of time before you do the negotiation?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Yeah, that is a very good question, and it happens all the time, particularly on government contracts. We have many of those where you've actually bid, you've got a fixed price, you know what it is. We just had a fixed price contract we're negotiating with in Mexico. Exactly the same issue. And the key is that whether the contract is fixed and the price is fixed or not, you have the identical problem. The question is, can the team deliver on that schedule or not? And so that's the first fact you've got to understand, regardless of the contract. I mean, no matter what the contract says, what comes out is going to come out. And as I showed you, today they almost all come out late. So the contract didn't matter. The contract didn't make it meet the schedule. It just was more painful when it didn't. So the key is, first of all, to go through what the commitment is and what the team can do. Now, when you have a contract, now you have a very clear statement of what the team needs to do. And now the team can go through and look at the alternative. And what we find teams do under those conditions, and we had exactly this case in one at Softec in Mexico City. I was just there a couple of weeks ago. The team actually goes through exactly what's required in the contract and what are we supposed to do. And here's the people we got for the team to do it. And the contract says deliver on this date. And it turns out we can either do all the work that's in the contract, but we need more people, or it's going to take us longer, or we got to cut some functions. And so management can go through that and decide what to do. And frequently, it's amazing, they'll sit down with the customers too and negotiate. It's amazing. Customers get very reasonable if you do it at the beginning and not at the end. When you wait and do it at delivery time and say, by the way, we're going to be 6 months late, they're unhappy. Right? But it's amazing when you sit down with the customer a year ahead of time and explain the problem with the details. The customers turn out to be reasonable. They want the product. They're not really wanting to argue about it. And so we found that it's amazing that worked. We had one case with the Navy where the Navy actually went through, and the team had this negotiation. The Navy contractor officer said, this was the best managed contract I have ever seen. So they had that negotiation up front. They knew what was going on every week. It makes a big difference. So it does help. It actually, it's not just a trust issue with the team and management, it's also a trust issue with the customer. Because now when you know where you are, all the debates you have between the customer and the supplier are different. Today, they're all bluffing. No one knows how long it's going to take. So everybody is kind of bluffing. But when you have a good data, a good plan, and the facts there, then people can sit down and they can negotiate on a trusting basis. And that's very helpful. Okay? Thank you so much. Very good question. Okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Humphrey.
There are such a